thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to come along. Perhaps more things you haven't heard about en route, let's see. It's a pleasure to input into your deliberations. What I thought I'd do today, reflecting the previous comments, is to just summarise what I have outlined for you in the paper, which is in your packs, and you can have a look through that. So this sort of aligns with that. And that is to really look at this issues around the income of older people in Ireland. I'll do it under three headings, which is just quickly, firstly, on the income and living standards of older people in this country. Then linked on to that, a look at the state pension, the importance of the state pension, and then some measures around the adequacy of the state pension as well. And I think at the tail end of all of that, that throws up some future challenges, which I know fall into the deliberations and discussions you're going to have. So I thought it'd be useful to point towards some issues around that as well. Let me start with a look at the income and living standards of older people. I'll do that on income first, briefly then on poverty and deprivation, which I'll come back to later. And I also thought it was interesting, as you'll see, to put in something here on wealth as well. We got some useful information there, which is related to, but slightly different for income, and very relevant, I think, in this context as well. Let me start with income first. And, well, what's the income of the average pensioner in Ireland? Well, the bottom of the table here is the answer. The average income of a pensioner in Ireland, this was in 2014, was just over €19,000. That's everybody aged over 66 years of age, or beg your pardon, 66 and over. Of course, some of those are still working, reflecting some of the earlier discussions. Some of them are long retired, so there's quite a mix of people in there, and averages are never necessarily perfect, which I'll come back to too. But that's what the average figure is. And if we look into that average figure, most of it, just over half of it, comes from the state old age pension. So that's the big source of pension income for pensioners in Ireland. And in fact, if you dig into that information more, you'll find that as you look at pensioners overall in society, the vast majority of pensioners derive most of their income from the state old age pension. So it's really important, and I'll come back to that point in a second. How does it do in terms of issues around poverty levels? Well, we have various ways of measuring poverty. They're really European measures which we apply here. For a single pensioner, we draw a poverty line at €12,000 a year. So if your income is below that, that's your disposable income, or your spending income after your taxes and so on, is below that, well, then you're deemed to be at risk of poverty or living below the poverty line. And for a pensioner couple, the poverty line is almost €20,000 a year, 19,920. So those are the poverty lines. If we look at pensioners in Irish society, 1 in every 10 pensioners then live below the poverty line. It's 10.7% from the latest figures. The Central Statistics Office do a survey of this every year. They look at incomes of everybody in society. That's how we know about incomes. And then from within that, we can look at the incomes of different groups like pensioners and others as well. So 1 in 10 pensioners are living with an income below the poverty line. So I suppose important to say, therefore, that 9 out of 10 pensioners aren't. So, we should see both sides of that. I thought it's interesting to look at that in the context of the population overall. The overall proportion of the Irish population living below the poverty line is just under 17% of the population. And if we look at it across the various age cohorts, well, the highest level of poverty is among children. So almost 20% of children, 1 in every 5 children, live in households who have an income that is below the poverty line. And that rate of pensioner poverty has fallen over time. The blue line here is the pensioner poverty rate. So if we look back I've drawn this from 2004 up to the latest figures we had, which was for 2015. Over time, that's fallen quite dramatically, actually, from quite a high position at the very start of this millennium. And that was driven by significant increases in welfare rates in the early years of this millennium. I'll come back to the fact that they had fallen behind, and therefore there was a sort of catch-up that happened in the first couple of years of the 2000s. And then down to around the current position, sitting at around 10%. Bounces around a bit, but at 10% over the last number of years. The other line out of interest there is a line for deprivation, which looks at the proportion of all the pensioners in Ireland who are living without some basic necessities, or two basic necessities of life. I've given you the list of those necessities in the paper. Interestingly, that's climbed over the period really of the economic recession for the last couple of years. So we're up around 15% of pensioners who might have an income above the poverty line, but nonetheless some of them are doing without certain resources. I thought it was interesting, as you look at issues of income for pensioners, and I'm conscious that that's the wording of the requests from the Oireachtas, but I thought it was interesting to point out to you at least what was, for the first time in many decades, new information that we got over the last year and a half on the wealth of people in Ireland. And for a long time, those of us who've looked at income and income issues have always sort of said, well, this is income, we don't really know a lot about wealth, although it's really important. Well, finally, we've begun to bridge that gap. And in a survey carried out in 2013, which was published in 2015, gave us our first sort of detailed insight in many, many decades into the wealth that people have in Ireland. And this is the wealth of households in Ireland, so this is looking at a household level. And what it found in 2013 is that the average, or the mean wealth of households in Ireland was just over almost 219,000 euro. They use a figure here, or a concept here, of net wealth, which is in effect really the stock of wealth that people have in housing, in land, in stocks and shares, in cash and other savings, whatever the case is. And they minus from that any debt that people have. So, for example, if you own a house, at least in name, that's valued at 200,000 euro, but you have a mortgage for 180,000 euro, well, then your net wealth there is 20,000. It's the bit that you own. And that's the case for this net wealth measure overall. So the average figure for a household in Ireland in 2013 was 218,900 euro. Averages can be a bit misleading when you talk about concepts like income and wealth, because those with very high levels of wealth will skew up the figures a little bit. So it's often more useful to look at a thing called the median, which is the value of the middle person in the distribution. If you line every household up from the household with the lowest wealth to the household with the highest wealth, and then you pick the household in the middle, well, that's the median figure, and so half are above and half are below that. And in Irish household terms, the median wealth in Irish households in 2013 was just over 100,000 euro. I think where this is interesting in terms of the deliberations you have is that we got a breakdown from that data as well as to, well, how does that wealth divide across the age groups? Now, it's not any particular surprise that over your lifetime, on average, people's wealth are accumulating, but it's worth looking at the figures at least. So if we talk about the cohort that you're interested in, those age 65 years and over, the median wealth of pensioners in Ireland was just over 200,000 euro. And in fact, that represents about a third of all the household wealth in the country is held by pensioners. In fact, when you dig into those figures, and there's quite detailed reports from the CSO on this, it's principally housing assets that make up that. And of course, within that group, there are elderly people who have no assets or no savings at all, and others who have very large amounts. But the middle figure is useful in terms of 200,000 euro, and it's a point I want to come back to at the tail end. Let me mention, as I said, something on the state pension and the importance of the state pension and its adequacy. The first thing to say is pretty clearly the state pension is the bedrock of the pension system. It is the bedrock of income for the vast majority of older people in Irish society. It's to take a line from the paper that I've given to you, it's only among pensioners living in the top 30% of Irish households that the state old age pension becomes a source of less than half their annual income. So for the vast majority of pensioners, their income derives from the state old age pension. There are variations you heard earlier in terms of the forms of the state old age pension, but nonetheless, it's the main source of income for the vast majority of pensioners. And I think it's important that we should never lose sight of that. If we think about all the other changes and all the other issues we're looking at, the bedrock is, and it's very hard to see how it would change, that the bedrock would in any way change from being the state old age pension as the main source of income for all pensioners in Irish society. How about its adequacy? Well, I think we can say that it does a relatively good job. I took some figures here from research from the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice, who have done a lot of work examining minimum incomes, minimum essential standards of living. And in effect what they do there is they establish the cost of what is a basic yet decent standard of living. So an adequate standard of living that allows somebody to have to be able to participate in society, to be able to take a holiday once a year, to be able to feed and clothe and heat themselves properly, and so on as well. So to have a decent and adequate standard of living. And they establish what that expenditure figure is, and then they compare it to, well, what income do you need to be able to afford that standard of living for that. And let me focus using their data on pensioners whose only income is the state pension. And what they show, just to maybe outline in the box I've highlighted here, and then it applies for all the others, they firstly make a distinction between pensioners living in urban Ireland and pensioners living in rural Ireland. Simply it costs more to live in rural Ireland than it does at a minimum standard of living than it does in urban Ireland. It's to do with issues around transport costs, some issues around heating costs being higher and food costs being higher as well. We can compare, they're comparing here, the adequacy of the pension received by a single pensioner from the non-contributory pension. And if you look at these data, they published for 2017 very recently, they show that it's just adequate, that the expenditure a pensioner has to incur to get a decent and acceptable standard of living more or less equals the income of that pensioner as well. So they can afford a decent standard of living. And it's the case also, that's the case also for the vast majority of the types of pensioner households they look at when you go on to pensioner couples and move on from single pensioners as well. There's an inadequacy, or there's a deficit in terms of being able to afford that for pensioners living in rural Ireland, and again it's just driven by the additional transport costs that those pensioner households face. And they're principally driven by that, and therefore that causes an adequacy issue. But for the vast majority of pensioner households, they are hitting that adequacy threshold. Of course, it assumes that those pensioners are healthy, and it assumes those pensioners are not incurring other expenses which might increase their living costs as well. But for average pensioners, it looks like that. And then let me finish my presentation to you with just to briefly highlight 5 future challenges that sort of draw on those observations as we think about the future of income for pensioners in Ireland. Firstly, on private pension provision and on the state pension, I think we can say that the old age pension does a very good job. If its objective is to keep people out of poverty, it does that pretty well. If its objective is to give people a reasonable standard of living in retirement, it does that pretty well as well. No system is or ever will be perfect, but it does a good job. We as a state spend an awful lot of money on private pensions and on the support of private pensions. The overall tax relief that goes into private pensions or to support private pension provision is about €2.4 billion per annum. You can argue that the discretionary part of that, if we were to change the system in one way, might free up the order of about €1.2 billion per annum. So there's quite a lot of resources put into supporting private pension provision. And very much that flows to those individuals and future pensioners who live towards the top of the income distribution, because really for others, the state pension is doing the job. I think there's questionable effectiveness around those private pension provisions, and somewhat of a concern too that we plan to spend more on it by rolling out other systems of auto-enrollment, which would, for example, which would bring more people into pension incomes and which would therefore cost more in terms of tax relief for the state to provide that. When you step back from it, certainly when I step back from it, I'm of the view that really we should be thinking about an enhanced old age pension, and that might be or is a better and cheaper solution for policy and for the state overall. In other words, everybody gets the old age pension. We should increase that to a slightly higher amount. The state can provide this, and in a sense I think should provide this and then no more. And then it should leave pensioners and their employers, if they have employer contributions, if they have an employer, alone to save beyond that. In other words, the state should do its job to provide a decent, adequate pension for all pensioners, and then beyond that, people should look after themselves. And I think that would be a much more efficient use of the resources that we have. Second, there is an issue as we look into the future around ensuring that the old age pension doesn't fall behind. And there is a real danger when you move into periods of economic recovery, which we're in now, that welfare payments broadly stay static and that the living standards of others move on. So that earnings rise, that income taxes fall, so therefore that disposable income or income after taxes rise for everybody, except for those who are dependent on welfare. So everybody moves on except for that group. And therefore those who are dependent on welfare can fall behind. And it's really interesting to see what happened in this country in the late 1990s and early 2000s when precisely that happened. The economy grew, there was significant recovery through that real Celtic Tiger period of Ireland. Earnings grew, income taxes fell, welfare moved a little bit, but most people moved on except for those who were dependent on welfare, who were static or who moved at a very slow pace and who fell behind. And it's crystallized in the poverty rates for those groups. So in 1994, 5% of Irish pensioners lived in poverty. By 2001, it was almost 1 in 2, almost half of Irish pensioners were below the poverty line. And it was simply that society moved on and those who had welfare-dependent incomes didn't. And therefore, it's important that we watch that and watch the allocation of resources to that group, because it's such a core part of the income of elderly people in our society. A third point on housing wealth, which I think is relevant when we're thinking about income. I suppose I'm looking principally here at older people now and in the future as we move towards this ageing population who are homeowners. That's not all older people, and that's important, but it is a fairly sizable cohort of that group. And I think there's merit in opening up methods of tapping into that household wealth. I mean, the current system, in effect, is that people save quite hard throughout their life to pay for the housing that they live in, and that they continue to live in that, and then there is some type of windfall gain post their death to their families who end up inheriting that resource. It seems to me there should be some method by which we can allow older people to tap into that household wealth in a small way, but way which would dramatically increase their living standards. I would have thought that should be a state scheme. It should be run on a non-profit basis. The state can work on that on a long-term horizon. Private companies really need returns on a short-term basis. The state can work on a much, much longer basis, and it will be a much better way to do it. I'm thinking about, as I've outlined in the paper to you, quite small amounts of money. It might be €5,000 a year up to €10,000 a year for a pensioner household. That's still €100 to €200 a week of additional resources. It would come from the value of their asset, and the state can claw that back from the estate of that individual ultimately. A bit like how we work the Fair Deal scheme at the moment. There's a good mechanism for working that, and we should be able to do it. It would reduce inheritances for some. I said, so what? For that, but it would increase the living standards for many older people. And I think there's an opportunity to do that there. It doesn't work for all older people, but it works for those with with housing, and I think we should, which is a lot of them, and I think we should really think about that. And two final points, Chair, to finish. A brief point more in the paper on it, on care infrastructure. Clearly, we, as our population ages, it's aging dramatically, and every new census from here on in will have a similar figure in terms of the growth of the number of older people in our society. We need to begin to plan better for the care infrastructure that will need to support that in so many ways. And then finally, I think there's probably a job too for us societally to understand the personal cost of retirement, or maybe put that better, how much you actually need to, and this is need, not want, to have in terms of income in retirement. There's often an assumed answer for that, which tends to be an exaggerated one. I think it's maybe useful to think about it in the context of some of the figures I showed you earlier. A pensioner couple need just over €16,000 a year for a minimum acceptable standard of living. That's a pretty decent standard of living. It's not fantastic, but it's a pretty decent standard of living. If you double that to €32,500 a year, I would have thought you have to ask questions, at least from a policy perspective, as to whether it is the case that the state needs to step in beyond that. Does it really need to be assisting people beyond that level in their retirement? That's or saving for their retirement. That's not to say they shouldn't be able to do that, but they should do that on their own back, whereas the state, I would have thought, has fulfilled its role when you get to that. And really, I think, therefore, policy shouldn't be overly concerned beyond that. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'll stop there.